Good evening, everybody. Welcome to week 9 of our readings. So in this reading, we actually get to look at a paper from 2008. And to put this paper in perspective, I guess to personalize it a little bit, why of all the papers in obscurity do I pick this one? Well, there's a couple reasons, and some of them are actually quite interesting and quite personal. And then something, are purely scientific. But to put this in perspective, it was 2008 when I first came across this paper. And I was doing it was published in 2008. I came across it in 2011 when I was doing my master's, forensic and investigative psychology. And I was asked to write an essay on crowd control, which I'll talk about in our course. I believe it's week 12. And I kind of wanted to take the idea of crowd control and study how it could be applied to explain the problem of terrorism. And so in doing so, I needed to study, if you will, what is the psychology of terrorism, given I knew close to nothing about it at that time. And in doing so, I came across this paper by John Horgan, who I feel like I'd heard his name, but possibly not. So this was kind of the first paper I came across. Anyway, fast forward. It's a funny life story, actually. Maybe that's why I picked this paper. Fast forward to 2012, either 2012 or 2013. I was at the UK Ministry of Defence working in their science lab. And it's a very long story, which one day I could tell if anyone is actually interested. But I basically wanted them to send me to Afghanistan, and they wouldn't. And so I think to stop me complaining, they basically said, "Well, we're working with this professor in Pennsylvania called John Horgan. Why don't you go out and meet with him? And perhaps that'll shut you up." And I was like, "Oh, John Horgan, I know that name." So I got on the plane. It's really funny. I got on the plane to go to America, and in my bag I had hard copies of this paper and then John Horgan's book, basically The Psychology of Terrorism, which doesn't look that good when you're stopped at airport security and your books are like The Psychology of Terrorism and a paper on the psychology of radicalization into terrorism. But, security and I had a good laugh. And anyway, I came out and I met John Horgan, and he was at the time working at Pennsylvania State University at a thing called the International Center for the Study of Terrorism. Now, this story does come to an end soon, I promise, and I actually talk about the paper. And anyway, in 2013 then, April of 2013, if I remember correctly, there was the Boston bombings, which coincidentally aligned with an effort by UMass Lowell at the time to bolster its security studies program. And to cut a long story short, UMass Lowell then recruited John Horgan to start the Center for Terrorism and Security Studies, which he did for 2 years, bringing me with him as a senior research associate. John Horgan then left. He's down in Georgia State now, doing some fantastic work down there. And I chose to stay at UMass Lowell for a range of reasons, really. But some to do with the Northeast, some to do with life, some to do with work, some to do with career. And I stayed at UMass Lowell and ended up taking on and taking over the Center for Terrorism and Security Studies. So in a weird way, you could almost say that this paper possibly put me in the seat that I'm now in talking to you about this paper, which is a strange to think about. But yeah, that's kind of, I guess, why I probably gravitate to a Horgan paper. But there's other reasons in that, and I think it would be disingenuous to say that it's solely selfish. John Horgan has a very, very good reputation in the field as, I think, a psychologist that critically thinks about the problem. And I mean, one of the things I would always say about John is he asks phenomenally smart questions. And what he often is very good at is he stops people getting carried away with an idea that they think solves more than it does. And that's what I really view this paper as. You know, I really view this paper as almost this kind of, you know, there's been, you'll remember I said in the class, you know, this post 9/11 explosion, pardon the pun, of experimental research on psychology, and this paper by John is like, whoa, we're getting very carried away with some psychological concepts. Let's revisit this and let's examine the kind of the psychology of this. And I mean, almost the first sentence is enough to make me happy. You know, a legacy of reductionist approaches to understanding terrorist behavior is not only confusion about what a psychology of terrorism implies, but also the realization that even some of the simplest analyses of terrorists produce inconsistent and confusing uses of psychological findings. I mean, he's absolutely right. At this time in 2008, there was just a fundamentally reductionist, which again is what I mentioned in the lecture, approach to asking questions about what causes terrorism. So John's title, you know, and again the next section, you know, sorry, my dog is chewing a stick. From profiles to pathways, from roots to roots, is this idea that prior to now, you know, the talk was about profiles and it was about roots and what are roots and what are profiles. Well, profiles we know are in a classic kind of forensic psychology sense, you know, the link of actions to characteristics. This is the inverse, you know, predicting characteristics in order to predict future actions. And roots are, to a degree, they're static kind of kind of entrenched concepts or static elements of experience under the soil or surface that then create the tree that you're now seeing above. But the main thing is that they are like, you know, kind of a physical presence. And that's what like John was kind of referring to here. You know, the issue being that, you know, a lot of the psychological literature has focused on these very, very static concepts. And to put John's view on this in perspective, what he was kind of at this point, he'd done a lot of field research with members of the IRA, which he did for his PhD. I believe in 1998 is when John got his PhD. I believe. Yeah, that sounds about right. So in 1998, he wrote, you know, he interviewed a lot of the IRA members and wrote a book, wrote a couple papers, the Green Book Volume 1, the Green Book Volume 2, about how they finance. So, you know, he had been out there. And this is the funny thing about early terrorism psychology, is it is absolutely amazing how many people can do terrorist psychology without ever speaking to a terrorist. In fact, there are even papers out there that hold that it is the moral high ground to never speak to a terrorist. And while I can see that, it leads to a double dissociation of theory and reality. Imagine anything, right? Imagine, okay, I'm going to use I'm trying not to use the golf analogy, but my brain is fried. This might be the best way. Imagine you tried to develop the psychology of golfers without ever speaking to a golfer. Imagine you tried to develop the psychology of professors without ever speaking to a professor. You can see how stereotype thinking or externalized thinking could easily lead to the development of this whole perception and science that is very, very fragile if you were to ever actually speak to someone. And I always draw this graph for my students on this idea of radicalization in this sense. And it's, you know, why was someone a terrorist? You know, arrow, because they were radicalized, okay? Arrow. How do you know they were radicalized? Arrow. Because they're a terrorist. Arrow. Why are they a terrorist? Because they're radicalized. Right? If you never actually speak to them and you hold the view that they're radicalized, you are always right, because anybody who is a terrorist is radicalized. And you know that they're radicalized because they're a terrorist. You've never actually asked one, from a cognitive standpoint, what do you believe in the justification or use of violence, in support of political aims? And that was what was going on here. And John was really asking quite interesting questions, basically about, speaking to terrorists and trying to work out this psychological process through which they went through. So anyway, he, at the bottom of the page, kind of down here on 82, he kind of cites this quite famous, House of Commons reports that basically kind of says, there is no profile because there's just immense inconsistency in the nature of individuals who are who we have arrested and convicted of terrorism, upon the leading up until now. And he kind of emphasises the quote here: much of the thinking about terrorism is still rooted in assumptions about profiling, while no terrorist profile is yet to be found, not only between members of different terrorist movements, but also among members of some particular movement. So that speaks to that kind of wider point I made earlier about kind of disaggregation. And in fact, John actually, he says something in here that often gets kind of overlooked, and it's on the top of page 84, and it's this conversation with Ariel Marari. And he kind of, Ariel Marari kind of argues that it is more precise to state that no terrorist profile has been found rather than there is no terrorist profile. And almost in terms of, John almost, to a degree, foreseeing the future, or, probably accurately, foreseeing, where he was, himself going to study. Ariel Marari is right, and I agree with him in that. What I would say about the idea of it's not that no terrorist profile exists, it's that in order to get an accurate profile, you need to ask an accurate question. So, what is the profile of a terrorist? Dumb question. What kind of mental illnesses are more prevalent in lone actor terrorists than terrorists who operate as part of a group? That is a good question, and that has an answer. The answer is, I think, schizophrenia is higher in lone actors than group members. I think, I'm trying to think what some of the other ones are. There's a graph that Emily Corner developed in 2014 that she published, but there's 3 or 4 specific DSM criteria that are more prevalent in lone actors than group actors. And so it's not that John is dismissing the concept of a profile. It's that the profile as currently conceptualized in the research literature is insufficient to answer the complex question that it's kind of, that it's working towards. And so what John's saying in kind of 84 is that basically, in assuming the existence of a profile, the quest for a profile basically blinds us to more important features that we're currently not focusing on. And so he says, the gradual nature of socialization processes. The idea of a profile assumes that you are or you aren't, right? Well, the socialization theory of terrorism, is that it's a slow building process. You don't just wake up one day and it's like, oh, hello, right, where's Al-Qaeda? I'm going to go join them. It's this gradual socialization. You're open to it. You first come into contact with it, and then you kind of work your way down that. So for example, I don't know if any of you are a gym goer. First analogy that comes to mind. If you know a serious gym goer, and many of us do, or like a committed fitness person. A dedicated gym goer will go to the gym, 5 times a day. They'll do different workouts each day. They'll have they'll do all the nutrition and everything, and they'll be really committed to their task. Or any elite person in any sport, think of how much LeBron James trains and works, and is committed to being a basketball player. You don't wake up one day and go, oh my God, suddenly I'm super committed to this one thing, and I'm gonna do everything all at once. Most things, it's a gradual socialization. You start by being introduced to the concept. Then you start to do a bit more of the concept. Then you start to do it once a week. Then you start to do it twice a week. Then you start to do a bit of reading around it, and you learn and you grow. It's the same thing with terrorism. You develop into a terrorist. You don't wake up one day. You're not born a terrorist. You don't wake up one day a terrorist based on these static personality profiles. You become one over time. It's slow building. And that kind of links to his second point, the sense of supportive qualities associated with recruitment, this idea that people are lured in by terrorism. Profiles are about you. You have factors and they make you risky. Well, that makes the group very passive. And the one thing we know about terrorist organizations is they actively pull people in. They recruit in ways that pull people in. They incentivize in ways that pull people in. The group is active in recruiting you as much as you are active in being vulnerable or at risk of being recruited. And then John says kind of a sense of migrating between roles, which is something that, he's very big on. It was one of the things we worked on a lot together was, the idea that within a terrorist organization, people hold different roles, and their transition through those roles is as important as their transition from a non-terrorist to a terrorist. You start off as running guns for the IRA, and the next thing you know, you're organizing meetings, and the next thing you know, you're coordinating an attack, and the next thing you know, you're the one that made the bomb. You've moved through 4 or 5 different stages there, and again, a profile doesn't do any of that. And then, a sense of importance of role qualities, so what attraction does being a sniper hold as opposed to becoming a suicide bomber, and how are they apparent to the onlooker or potential recruit? It's all about this interaction and complexity, both of what it means to be a terrorist and how you end up one in terms of an interaction with a group that are actively trying to recruit you. In fact, the paper that I almost set and didn't, because it was egocentric and narcissistic, was I wrote a paper in 2017 in the American Psychologist, which is, one of the APA's. It's actually a special issue that John and I put together about bringing psychology and terrorist psychology to the masses almost. We wrote this paper about recruitment and, using the lens of, how do Apple and Samsung recruit? And how does that help explain how, Al-Qaeda or the IRA recruit? The recruitment stuff's really interesting because, groups sometimes recruit specialists, they recruit generalists, they recruit everybody's, they recruit elites. It's this interaction between the two sometimes. And this profile idea just doesn't get there. Well, I will say that if you just go down halfway down page 84, you see this great quote from John about, a senior officer saying profiles are useful. Of course they are. The reason is that your average suicide bomber is not going to be a middle-aged white father of 3 kids. Yeah, I'm pretty sure I could find you one, but what he's mentioning there is basically that there is still this desperate want for there to be a profile. There is still very much a desperate need almost for there to be a profile because people just want it. But what John says, and he kind of says it from 84 through to through into 85, is that if you ask for a profile, you're looking for static personality traits. But if you think about it as a process, then the things that you're looking for as risk factors, if you will, are far more almost open and fluid and, almost with those, quest for significant concepts. And so he kind of identifies a few: dissatisfaction with current activities, identifying with the victim, and then a sense of reward from being recruited, and kinship or social ties. These aren't things that you have as binary personality traits. They're factors in your environment that, that could make you more at risk of being a terrorist. And so that's what John's saying. He's saying that, profiles are static and they're tick boxes. The pathways idea, is looking about what's going on in this person's, experience and life, and how is that making them more at risk. And then he kind of goes on to page 86, so I think it's a really interesting concept, kind of 86 through 87 and kind of 88 basically and into 89. He kind of talks about this idea of if you ask the question of what makes someone a terrorist, your interest in them stops almost the minute they become a terrorist. And what John's saying, and this is something that John later extended into what he called kind of the IED model, which is involvement, engagement, disengagement, is basically this idea that there's a life course of what it means to be a terrorist. And if you think about it more in terms of that life course, the really interesting question becomes, okay, so what gets someone involved in terrorism? But then what keeps them involved? What after they've dipped a toe, what makes them want more? What makes them engage? What makes them increase their commitment or scale up their commitment? What makes someone want to take on more roles, to become more central, to take it to that next level of commitment? Oh my God, my dog is currently trying to get my cat to chase him while he carries a shoe in his mouth. It is not going to end well. Bodhi, what are you doing? Okay, good boy. Multiple pets. And so that what he's basically saying is, if you adopt this pathway approach, you can ask so many more interesting psychological questions, because you're viewing the longevity, the arc, the story of being involved in terrorism as this life course, rather than just, if anything, this binary moment where you are, and in a minute ago you were not. John's idea is about increasing commitment, escalations of commitment, moving through roles, career. It's the same example I gave in class. You wouldn't say to someone, how do you profile a doctor? You'd be like, right, how does someone go from high school developing an interest in being a doctor to going through medical school, to picking a specialty, to deciding to be a surgeon, to all this kind of stuff? They go through so many different stages to get to that end place. And that's kind of what John is kind of tipping at and kind of getting at here. And then finally, I'll just go with the kind of the page 90 through to the conclusions. He's basically just saying that if we abandon to a degree the profiles approach, the static profiles approach, and we adopt and embrace this idea that terrorism is a process. There's a process into terrorism, there's a process through terrorism, and there's a process out of terrorism. Then we can start to ask better psychological questions. And by asking better psychological questions, we're actually better equipped to actually prevent the thing that we're looking to prevent. Profiles are about spotting terrorists, stopping people from becoming terrorists. It's about almost prioritization, right? Who's going to be a terrorist? Prioritize them. The pathways idea is that people are pulled in for different sociological reasons, things about the group, things about their life, and then once they're in, that doesn't mean they're gone. They're not gone. They still have to escalate their involvement. So you could still help them de-escalate their involvement, and once they're involved, you can still disengage them. You can still bring them back from the brink, right? It's a far more interactive, fluid and malleable psychological process than a very static view of this person's got these characteristics, ipso facto, permanento, they're going to be a terrorist. And I really think that that's what John was almost preaching in this paper, just this idea of, embrace that it's complicated, but it has longevity and it's malleable. Embrace that in your understanding, embrace that in your theory, and if you do that, you can embrace it in terms of how we counter and undo and rehabilitate and all of these kind of questions. So I hope that you enjoyed this presentation, whatever, lecture reading. I apologize for the dog going to war with my shoe in the background. I hope that didn't disturb anyone too much. And just enjoy it. I mean, I really do remember in 2011, I remember reading this paper, and it's funny. It's just another one of those ones that's always stuck with me. And maybe it's because a couple of years later I was, working alongside John, and we were, chasing these answers together, and all the things that we did together between 2013 and 2017, or 2013, 2012, 2015, who knows, something like that. Or maybe it's just a great paper. But I mean, I was talking to someone the other day about it, and even he was like, "Oh, you mean profiles to pathways?" I was like, "Exactly. It's just a a classic paper that everybody knows. Maybe it's just a great name. But I hope you enjoy it. I hope you enjoyed this reading. And I very much look forward to the next one. So thank you very much. And I hope you have a wonderful week.